But I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Budapest is my first time here. It's a beautiful city. And very pleased also to come after Matthias, who talked about the importance of the feminist critical analysis of legal framework, but also zoned in on mass atrocities or sexual violence outside of conflict situations. And my presentation really comes with a bit of a daring to how we think about mass atrocity. And this daring is, my first question is, when do we start calling sexual violence a mass atrocity? And for me, and I believe the reality that many women in Angola and throughout the African continent experience is that we feel that there's a war happening, and this war is against our bodies, and we suffer every day. Let me zone in a bit in the reality of Angola. Statistics on sexual violence are at best unreliable. For most situations, they don't exist. But we have reports from one specific doctor in one small clinic in Rwanda, which is where I live, that daily he receives between 9 and 10 cases of women, a lot of them young, who are victims of rape. So this is one small clinic in one small town. If you know the map of Angola, Rwanda is literally a dot. And then I ask myself, if we scale up this to the entire province, and we scale this up to the entire country, how many women are being raped on a daily basis? How many young women are being victims of rape? And can we not classify that as a mass atrocity? So it happens outside of a war context, right? But it happens at a scale that is scary, right? So this is really my first dare to this panel, is what can sexual violence that happens outside of conflict tell us about preventing sexual violence in conflict? Because we know, and I think my previous speakers in the panel have said that already, conflict poses sexual violence in our faces, right? We can't deny the fact. But what can the sexual violence that happens outside of conflict generally tell us about how it happens in conflict, right? Because it doesn't come out of the blue. Women's bodies are being victimized every day. And then as the keynote speaker addressed, in conflict, we put in a situation where it's not only about power over women's body, it's also about power over your opponent, over the person you're fighting against, right? And many times, it's not only over women's bodies, but also over male bodies that in this process are alienated and subjugated and feminized, I would say. So I think this there, for me, is very important, because I would say that the mass atrocity of sexual violence is upon us in Angola and everywhere in the world. Every day, women are being raped, are being neglected their rights all over the world. And I think the Me Too campaign that people have referred to has shown us that this is not a problem of the global south, this is not a problem of an African country, it is a global problem, right? How many women across the world are being subjected to sexual violence? How many men are being subjected to sexual violence? So I think we need to start addressing sexual violence as a mass atrocity today, and not to wait for the conflict situations where it's accentuated or aggravated. Talking a bit about prevention and focusing in a bit on Africa, Matthias talked about a lot of the provisions that exist at the level of the European Union, and gave me an idea to include in my presentation also what African countries have been doing at the regional level. So we have this, what I think, very revolutionary document that is the Protocol to the African Charter of Peoples and Women's Rights, the Peoples and Humans Rights, which is called, for short, the Protocol of Maputo, which really is revolutionary in the sense that it defines what is harmful practices for women. So anything that denies you the right to dignity, integrity, and a fulfilling life is defined by the protocol as a harmful practice. And it's in the basis of this that also sexual violence against women is being framed, or should be framed in discussions in most African countries. The protocol has been ratified by, I think, 37 countries, some of whom have signed with reservations. But by and wide, large majority of African countries have signed and are vinculated by this protocol. Angola is case in point. So when you talk about prevention, and I think for my particular work, I think of this regulatory frameworks. In Angola, we are subject to the Maputo Protocol. We have domestic legislation that only, unfortunately, addresses domestic violence, not even looking at violence against women or sexual violence as a particular type of violence. But in our work, we think that prevention should go beyond the rule of law. And we're very deliberate about that, because we think that legal frameworks are good, but we have to address the root causes of the problem. And the root cause of sexual violence is biased gender norms, is patriarchy, is the idea that you can subjugate someone's body, some woman's body to your control. So in our work of prevention, we very much defend that it's necessary to have a conversation about changing norms as well, changing societal norms to how we see women, to how we understand gender relations. And I also wanted to say that even within the reality of Africa, prevention also needs to cross borders. It's not work that needs to be done individually. It's not work that Angola can do on its own. And then to hear one of the examples that I wanted to focus in is the case that a lot of the sexual violence that happens in Angola, for example, and Georgie will be a bit lost because I said I would focus on urban Angola, but I'm a bit all over the place. But a lot of the sexual violence that happens in Angola and many other African countries happens in areas of mineral exploitation. So you have global actors present at those sites, for example, global multinational corporations. So how do you address that? How do you address this specific problem, this specific sexual violence that is not only under the control of one particular state? So it requires international cooperation, which has been emphasized by several of my colleagues today. So one of the particular things that I'm excited about as an activist in terms of international cooperation for preventing violence in general, but also give some potential for preventing sexual violence against women in Africa is the binding treaty on corporate responsibility. So I was trying not to be long, and I think I will leave a lot of room for questions, but this is really the provocation that I wanted to leave. When do we start calling rape and sexual violence a mass atrocity? And my provocation is the mass atrocity is happening now. It's happening today, it's happening every day, and we need to respond to it accordingly. And this response in terms of prevention, for me, needs to happen at 3 levels. At the global level, in terms of regional actions, it needs to happen at the conscious raising level, right? In terms of us understanding and reconceptualizing gender relations and patriarchal relations, and it also needs to happen at the legislative or the legal level, because it is binding. And I'll give you an example here with the relevance of the Maputo Protocol. In March this year, the Angolan parliament threatened to pass a bill that would completely outlaw abortion. Our penal code is from 1886, and it currently permits abortion in the situation where it's to prevent women's honor, whatever that means. So as activists, as feminist activists, we're actually very concerned about this potential take away of our rights, particularly in a context where I told you 9 to 10 women at least are being raped every day, and many of those situations end up in unwanted pregnancies. So the Maputo Protocol really was our resource, because Angola ratified in 2007, and we used this instrument to force Parliament to withdraw the intention to completely outlaw abortion, because the Maputo Protocol actually forces every African country, every member state that signed, to permit medical abortions in the case of rape, in the case of the pregnancy poses a threat to the woman's life, and also in case of the fetus is inviable. So this is a way that we can see regional or even international instruments being used to defend rights at the local level, to defend sexual and reproductive rights. And with this, it's my 5 minutes of glory. I'd like to open the floor for questions, I think later. Thank you so much.